I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. It's the latest chapter in the saga of critical race theory in UK schools. We've heard everything from white privilege to unconscious bias to inherited trauma, and it's certainly a lucrative business. But tonight we'll be speaking to GB News Investigates reporter Charlie Peters, who has been in touch with disgruntled parents as well as the diversity consultants in question. In better news, might the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, have found the solution to the woes of NHS waiting lists? Well, he's axed 1 in 6 civil servants working for the Department of Health and Social Care to help redirect funds towards the front line of our services. I hate to say I told you so. Ministers are drawing up plans to tackle shoplifting. Repeat offenders will be handed mandatory prison sentences. Could this be a crucial step in fixing broken Britain? Well, State of the Nation's very own alleged criminal barrister may be able to answer that one. Plus, 2 of Britain's foremost prominent former colonies, Australia and the United States, are enhancing their strategic and military relations amidst increasing tension from the looming threat of the Chinese communists. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by an astute panel this evening, criminal barrister and former Tory MP Jerry Hayes and the author and broadcaster Amy Nicole Turner. As always, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. And now it's time for the news of the day with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you. Good evening to you. Well, the top story tonight is that a Home Office source has, within the last hour, told GB News the Bibby Stockholm accommodation barge will not be taking new arrivals tomorrow, and it could be next week now before any migrants move on board. An initial group of asylum seekers was expected to be sent to the accommodation, which is moored off Portland in Dorset today. The source also said, however, the delay this time is because of health and safety practices which need to be signed off for port workers, adding there are no fire safety issues. In an exclusive interview today, the Prime Minister told GB News housing illegal migrants in hotels and flats is completely wrong, and said alternatives like the Bibby Stockholm are being sought as interim measures.
What's going on currently is completely wrong. We've got a situation which is unfair. British taxpayers are forking out £6 million a day to house illegal migrants in hotels and other accommodation. That's clearly wrong, it's clearly unfair, and that's why I want to put an end to it.
Well, the Bibby Stockholm can accommodate up to 500 people, but new figures show that more than 3,000 people crossed the English Channel in 63 small boats last month alone. With an average of 52 migrants per boat, that's the highest number on record. More than 14,000 people have made the dangerous crossing across the English Channel so far this year. Now, the Prime Minister has introduced what he's calling the biggest shake-up of alcohol taxes in a century. The move focuses on taxing drinks on their alcoholic strength, with duty on wine and vodka, for example, to rise. Touring a beer festival in West London today, Rishi Sunak claimed the overhaul made things simpler, fairer and would benefit thousands of businesses. But the British Beer and Pub Association says it will cost the industry an extra £225 million in taxes. The MP, Margaret Ferrier, has been stripped of her seat after a recall petition which triggered a by-election. She was charged by police and suspended from the Commons for breaking COVID rules by travelling from London to Scotland after testing positive for COVID in September 2020. Well, nearly 12,000 constituents in Rutherglen and Hamilton West signed the petition. It's going to be the first recall by-election in Scotland. Now, house prices have fallen at their fastest annual rate for 14 years. The Nationwide says the average price dropped by 3.8% over the last 12 months. The average UK home now costs around £260,000. A drone delivery service has been launched on the Orkney Islands, helping locals receive their mail more efficiently. A collaboration between Royal Mail and drone company Skyports means the scheme will transport letters and parcels between the islands and hopefully with significantly improved delivery times. The service will initially operate on a trial basis for 3 months. If it's successful, it could be established as a permanent service. This is GB News across the UK, on your TV, in your car, on your digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Back now, though, to Jacob.
Critical race theory is the idea that racism is entrenched in our society, that society at its very core is racist. It views everything through the lens of race, that history should be read through the perspective of racial hierarchies, that children need re-educating to free them from their unconscious bias, that all inequalities in society are caused by racism, and that Western societies are fundamentally white supremacist. That is why thousands of British schools are teaching critical race theory to our children, in some cases as young as 5 years old. Earlier this month, we covered the report published by Don't Divide Us, which revealed an extensive investigation into the third-party organisations who are indoctrinating our children for costly fees, often paid for by local councils, that is, you, the taxpayer. It revealed that a school in North London called Coldfall Primary School had been providing lessons from another third-party organisation, but these lessons were in fact racist as they were only for black students. As part of its plans to become an actively anti-racist school, it had also been instructing the children to repeat the following pledge. Intent does not supersede impact. I will listen to children's concerns and experiences. I will allow all voices to be heard. I will refer any racist instance or suspected racist instance. I will be actively anti-racist. This is Maoist-style indoctrination which speaks for itself, but today the Times revealed in its investigation, explaining how yet another third-party organisation is responsible for sinister lessons that are taking place. In this case, the organisation is called The Key, a national information service with £30 million of funding and more than 13,000 schools as clients. Now, these schools receive their funding from taxpayers, so it's funded essentially by you. In other words, primarily from us. Documents revealed the organisation, which claims to have its lessons put together by the relevant experts, argues that children are never too young to be educated about race. Indeed, it even referred to an American infographic which states that white 5-year-olds are strongly biased in favour of whiteness. The documents also suggest the importance of teaching primary school students about the murder of George Floyd in America. These are students in the UK. But these theories are highly contentious political ideologies. Not only should they not be taught as fact, but they've actually been widely and successfully disproved. Britain is a success story for its minority groups. In terms of economic outcomes, British Indians and British Chinese are the most prosperous groups in the United Kingdom, outperforming the white population. More minority groups proportionally go on to higher education than the white population. The Sewell report, commissioned by Boris Johnson in light of the Black Lives Matter protests, found that systemic racism is not a major factor in determining outcomes for minorities. This is even clear in an international perspective. Groups that suffer discrimination far more than they'd ever suffer in Britain often hugely outperform the populations at large in which they reside. For example, the Malaysian Chinese. But critical race theory, especially when taught to young children who are none the wiser, preaches a message of victimhood and hopelessness, that no matter how hard you work, you won't make a success of yourself because society is rigged against you. This is a pernicious narrative because Britain is a success story. People succeed on their own efforts through meritocracy. It's a success story for its minorities, and the proof is in the pudding. But of course, I want to know your thoughts. Don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. I'm joined now by GB News Investigates reporter Charlie Peters, who has been in touch with one of the diversity consultants at the North London school embroiled in scandals, as well as one of the parents. Charlie, what have you found in your investigations?
Some very concerned parents. A parent indeed today sent me some science homework from the school in North London where pupils were tasked with finding examples of scientists that supposedly challenge the myth that scientists are old men with crazy hair. It goes on to list a group of scientists that they think would be acceptable for pupils to refer to in terms of scientists to praise. Of these 10 scientists, they're all either ethnic minorities or women, and they give a list of 3 scientists who they say students should not refer to because they're too famous and too well known. That is Albert Einstein, Louis Pasteur, and Stephen Hawking, 3 white men. Now, this parent said to me, this is a form of divisive education, which was essentially telling pupils to look for scientists outside of Europe, outside of America, and telling them that science is no place for white men and they should try and recover a more diverse attitude towards the sciences. Now, when I spoke to Don't Divide Us, the campaign you referenced in your monologue, they said that this was reducing science to identity, which is a travesty in general, but particularly bad, they said, when you're dealing with primary school pupils who are just discovering the wonders of science and should be learning about its potential, and instead are being forced what Don't Divide Us described as a sociological movement about power.
And they're excluding some of the most famous scientists of history from this group. But there are other problems as well, aren't there? What else have you found in your inquiries?
Well, when referring to that pledge that you discussed, this was conducted with a consultancy, a third group that came into the school who were paid, we believe, quite high sums to give their training to the school. Pupils in years 5 and year 6 were given anti-racism workshops and taught all these things. I think critics and pupils in the school...
This is the Key, is that the organisation that's
Key is a much bigger organisation.
It's a bigger organisation. OK, this is a specific, smaller organisation.
A specific group called Arise. And critics in the school and concerned parents have said that they believe there's a direct link between this anti-racism training and the arrival of a new way of thinking in the curriculum, which is trying to get rid of white men and sees whiteness as a problem and not focusing on pure academia.
But isn't it also dispiriting for people from minority groups because it's telling them that whatever they do, they can't succeed in the society in which they're in, which is palpably untrue?
I think, I imagine for many of the pupils, it must be quite dispiriting and disturbing at a young age to be told, black scientists aren't taken seriously, or if you're a white man, you'll get ahead, but others won't. A lot of the parents I spoke to on this story said that this is pushing a divisive idea within education and failing to kind of co-opt what should be the most important part of this, which is teaching pupils about the beauty of science. Now, when I reached out to Coldfield Primary School in Muswell Hill, they did not respond to our request for comment at time of publishing a story, but we look forward to hearing from them.
To hearing from them, try and explain what they're trying to do. But it's 13,000 schools that seem to be subscribing to this. So this is pretty commonplace. Indeed, my own daughter was asked to do a similar project on scientists and to try and find scientists who were, for example, non-binary. She actually chose Stephen Hawking because he was so severely disabled that was unusual and different. But it's excluding people who we ought to be studying and ought to know about as part of an understanding of science.
Don't Divide Us said very clearly that they thought this was a divisive message because it focused on identity more than knowledge, which, again, is a pernicious idea in general, but especially bad when you are dealing with the youngest minds at the earliest stage of their education to be teaching these kind of views. And as you said, 13,000 schools and educational trusts receiving more work from the Key, which is just one group as referenced in the recent Don't Divide Us report. We imagine there are dozens of others reporting on similar concerning issues.
And it's the issue of indoctrination as well that is a concern, isn't it? Because you're dealing with such young minds that you're trying to mould them to have a specific view of society. It becomes very political, and schools are not places where politics should be thrust down the throats of children.
It's very political, but defenders of this move would say that these are uncontested views, that these are not political ideas, that this is just right versus wrong, and that these are laws of nature rather than areas of open debate. They don't believe, I believe, from what I've seen, that this kind of stuff should be up for discussion. It is what it is.
It is what it is, and they have an ideological view that they are trying to spread across the country at large. Well, thank you very much, Charlie. I'm now joined by my friend of the programme, the filmmaker and activist Femi Nalanda. Femi, thank you so much for joining us again. Now, my daughter Mary, was told at her school that thinking of black people with crime was thinking of peanut butter and Jell-O. Is that a thing any child in the United Kingdom should be told?
I'm not sure I understand what that statement is supposed to say. But what I will say is that the idea that young children are not in any way indoctrinated or taught things that are political in other senses in this country is just not true. I mean, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds are told to celebrate the Jubilee when that comes along, things like that. That's a political act, celebrating the monarchy. The monarchy is a contentious institution in this country. We're told from very, very young age things like Churchill was a great person. We're given a very, very, very specific view of history. We're taught geography, we're taught all of these subjects from a very young age. Education in and of itself is the way we shape the worldviews of the next generation of people. And part of the reason the UK has such a problem coming to terms with its history and coming to terms with its present and some of the issues it has with racism in its present is because of our education system. Not even to go into the fact that the education system was found to be one of the, in terms of kind of ethnic minority and white students, I think the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development a few years ago found that the UK has one of the most segregated school systems in the world. Ethnic minority students go to their schools, white students go to their schools, and they don't mix enough. So, of course, racism is something which exists in the country, and of course, it's something which we should learn about from a young age.
But this isn't learning that racism exists as something and that there are some racist people. It's assuming that the whole of society is structured on a racist basis, and that is self-evidently in this country not true.
I mean, that is true in this country, that there's racism embedded into the structure of this country, which is something which isn't surprising.
How can we have a Prime Minister, a Home Secretary, a Foreign Secretary, who are all from ethnic minority backgrounds? How do we manage that if we're such a racist country?
If you want my honest opinion, if you want my honest opinion on why, let's talk about the Home Secretary, for example, on why Suella Braverman, Priti Patel, these people have been co-opted into the role of Home Secretary. It's because if you had a white Home Secretary saying, let's ship all the refugees off to Rwanda, it would be a much more contentious statement. I mean, the Conservative Party has done a wonderful job at co-opting a few minorities to get away with saying things that they haven't been able to say in the past, and to get away with pushing some of their most anti-migrant, anti-human rights policies.
But that's not true. This has been said by every member of the Conservative Party. I mean, even Ken Clarke, who you can't claim is from an ethnic minority, has made it clear that he supports the policy of sending people to Rwanda. This has huge support in the country at large. And I think to view Suella Braverman as a veneer is desperately disrespectful to her.
I think she's a desperately disrespectful person in her own right. So I'm not too. She's only there because
agree with her
of the fact
politically, but that's different. It's fair enough not to agree with her politically, but to think that she's a patsy seems to me to be entirely unreasonable and something for which you have no evidence.
I don't think so. I don't think. Well, I mean, saying things without evidence is something which you're very well acquainted with, and which GBNews is very well acquainted with at the end of the day. But nonetheless, when we look at the facts, you asked me for my opinion, and my opinion is the reason that there are so many ethnic minorities high up in a party, a political party, which in and of itself is very anti-minority, very anti-migrant, it seems self-evident. But nonetheless, let's move away from that, because that's
this is
we're discussing.
Wishing to have it both ways.
Let's move away from
so
that.
if there's any evidence that Britain isn't racist, you say that's mere tokenism. And if there's any evidence that there is racism, you say, well, that's endemic across the whole of society.
There's plenty of evidence that Britain. No, there's plenty of evidence that in many ways Britain is progressive, and there's many parts of Britain that have progressive tendencies. There's many people in Britain who are very welcoming to people from other cultures. But that's not to say that when you look at the structures of economics in this country, who is poor, who is rich, when you look at the structures of who attends elite universities, you mentioned your daughter before. I'm pretty sure that all 6 of your kids, Jacob, probably go to very luxurious public schools. Do you know how many black people will go to schools like that?
But the Indians and the Chinese in this country are not only rich, but they're going to the top universities in considerable numbers. That's the success of it.
Of course. I mean, I'm not denying. There's no.
I hope to have you back on again, perhaps in the studio next time. But thank you very much. And don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, the great health secretary, is he doing more for government efficiency than anyone else? And plus, why Britain won't become San Francisco after all.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nah, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Leon says, as a dual heritage person myself, I'm saddened by the protected characteristics top trumps that has entered our nation. No doubt this has something to do with ESG and an attempt to lessen the consequences for the elite when the population form ranks. And Angela says, I home-educated my daughter at age 8 years of age as I could not cope with what she was being taught. That was 30 years ago. Every blessing. Thank you, Angela. When I was the Minister for Government Efficiency, I was very strongly egged on by the then Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Steve Barclay, as we were developing a plan to reduce the civil service numbers by 90,000 back to where it was in 2015-16, in an attempt to rationalise the workforce, working towards a smaller, more efficient, but potentially better paid civil service. Unfortunately, when the current Prime Minister took office, he ignored these plans, but new figures from the Department of Health and Social Care have revealed, as a result of a written question that I asked in Parliament, that the department has axed 1 in 6 civil service jobs within 7 or 8 months in a bid to direct funds towards the front line of the NHS to help tackle waiting lists. We've explained on this programme in the past that Britain once ruled the world with a vastly smaller civil service, and now it's become bloated and bureaucratic. Indeed, the latest figures show 40% of the workforce still working from home. Cutting back on Whitehall waste is a crucial part of getting costs under control, paving the way for cutting taxes and unleashing Britain's growth. Well, I'm now joined by my panel, the barrister and former Tory MP Jerry Hayes and the author and broadcaster Amy Nicole Turner. Amy, this is great news, isn't it? Steve Barclay's done a fabulous job to get rid of the sixth civil servants, so money's available for doctors and nurses.
It just worries me how this conversation is framed and some of the language around it. So war on waste, I think it leans into that idea that civil servants, it's a bloated civil servants, and that tendency to demonise civil servants. I've got some ways that you've referred to them in the past, blizzard of veritable snowflakes, complete wet wipes. I don't know whether that's the best way to encourage
we have had blizzards of
a good relationship,
snowflakes.
because the relationship between ministers and the public sector is so crucial, isn't it? And they are so valuable, so they deserve a bit more respect and
Some
a bit
of
more...
the civil servants, as I've said many times, I worked with were absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
The private offices that I worked with were really hard-working, but the numbers have risen and risen. 2015-16, there were 90,000 fewer than there are now, and we need to get back to sensible numbers. And Steve Barclay is showing that that is possible, and that saves taxpayers' money.
But that's in a way where morale is getting lower and lower and lower. So only 27% of civil servants feel they're paid adequately, and most of them say, so there's a quote from the... From one of the union reps saying that civil servants, there's hardly any that aren't looking for another job right now because they feel so undervalued. So that's not going to...
And Jacob would say, well, what very good news indeed. But I had to write this down, Jacob. I just couldn't believe it. That you were the Minister for Government Efficiency.
I was Jim Hacker.
Really, if ever there's an oxymoron,
I was Jim
it
Hacker.
is that.
I was
unbelievable.
But the Minister for Administrative Affairs.
Yes, of course. Yes. Right. Look, every government does this just before a general election, and so does the opposition. There's waste in the National Health Service, of course there is. All we need to do to fund growth and get the economy going is to cut the waste.
Actually,
and they never do.
But that's not true. Francis Moore did it, and Michael Heseltine did it.
Yes.
When I became Minister for Government Efficiency, to the surprise of some people, I took into the office Michael Heseltine's memoirs, because that explained how to cut the civil service and maintain efficiency.
Yes, in a sensible way. In many ways, Amy, I can see your point, because there are decent civil servants, and most of them, particularly at a higher level, work really, really, really hard, and they don't want to be demoralised. But listening to Sedwell today, Mark Sedwell, who used to be the chief cabinet secretary, he's just saying the system is broken. That's what we should be looking at. The system is broken. Ministers get into power. All right, most of the time, if you're a Secretary of State, you're reading yourself in, and by the time you're finally sacked, you've finally understood the job. But the fact is, you can't use the levers of power because the system is broken.
That, I think, is a fundamental point, that the levers don't seem to be connected, and it's the civil service that is meant to be the connection.
I think the civil service is basically the skeleton of government, and whilst the ministers come and go, in the fact that they are there, the foundation, the most important part.
What's the skeleton of government?
They understand.
It's for the politicians to put the flesh on the bones, but we're about to put other flesh on different bones, because speaking of government efficiency, like all things COVID-related, COVID inquiry spent oodles of your money after just 23 days of hearing evidence. Thus far, the ill-defined inquiry has spent nearly £40 million, half of which has been spent, Jerry will like this, on lawyers conducting the inquiry's investigations. But the question is, was this inquiry doomed from the start when its terms of reference are so broad that they cover practically everything that happened in the UK that was even remotely related to COVID? Well, Jerry, as I mentioned lawyers, I'll give you the first word.
I'm a criminal lawyer. I mean, it's ridiculous.
In 23 days...
Oh, just look at the Savile inquiry. Look at every inquiry. The people who make money, masses, millions of pounds some of these lawyers will have. For what? At the end of the day, right, we weren't prepared. We weren't prepared because we're expecting a flu epidemic. Things went wrong, and also we weren't prepared for PPI. That's the end of it.
Isn't Jerry right that that's basically the inquiry?
That's it.
We thought it was going to be a flu epidemic. We bought PPE that was expensive, and we got a vaccine, and we did it quickly, and that lockdown's probably a mistake. Inquiry done and dusted. And
I really wish it was that simple, and I think that the 200,000 plus victims and bereaved families probably would want a very thorough inquiry, because one of the whole reasons COVID was so devastating was because of a lack of preparedness. So surely, in order to completely understand...
that's not true.
How do we know it's not true? Because the inquiry's not even finished yet.
Death rates in countries across the world were pretty similar.
Yeah.
Almost regardless of what they did, whether they did nothing or
but each country's doing their own inquiry.
A new disease came and people died.
200,000 people lost their lives, and we can't say that. So the inquiry is set to cost 200 million, which is on par with the Savile inquiry,
no government knew how to deal with it.
It was a new disease.
They were relying on, we talk about SAGE, but if you've got about 150 different people who couldn't make a decision because they were about 150 different decisions.
That's precisely why we need an inquiry.
No, you don't need an inquiry for that. That's just the way government works. You had the chief scientific officer who had to say, look, this is on balance, Minister, what we think. You've got to make a political decision. And it's darn difficult, if not impossible. I don't blame the government for that. I really don't. Any government throughout the world. I really don't.
And it seems very unlikely that whatever the inquiry comes up with, it will be any different in future. However, unfortunately, we've got to move on because we have messages from our sponsors, which I know everyone likes to listen to. But thank you to my brilliant panel. Coming up, could ministers have found a way to fix broken Britain, and should Peking duck?
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hi there, it's Aidan McGivern here with the GB News forecast. Turning wet again overnight. Heavy showers replace the rain into Wednesday, but unseasonable winds, especially along southern coastal parts of England. An area of low pressure is developing over the Atlantic. That's going to move through central parts overnight. It's going to bring the strongest winds on the southern flank, and some heavy rain ahead of it into Northern Ireland later this evening, passing through Wales, southern and central England, and then eventually northern and eastern England, seeing the wet weather by dawn, as well as southern Scotland. Now, northern Scotland stays clear overnight, and here temperatures will dip into the single figures, but elsewhere those temperatures will stay at 13, 14, 15 Celsius. But it is a wet and windy start to Wednesday. The wettest weather will be across Northern Ireland, central and southern Scotland, northern England. Another band of rain moves through southern counties for a while, carried through on a strengthening wind with the risk of gales for coastal areas, 50, perhaps 60 mile-per-hour wind gusts. That could cause impacts if you're taking part in outdoor activities, for example, or camping. And another thing that could be impactful, very heavy showers and thunderstorms through central parts. That all clears through, and by Thursday it's a much brighter start to the day. Some sunshine out there. Quite quickly though, the cloud fills in and further showers develop by the afternoon. Hit and miss downpours, and the wind from the north will make it feel on the cold side. Similar conditions on Friday before another low arrives on Saturday.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often there will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your views. Alan says, all this money, here's the outcome for nothing. Lessons must be learned. And also hello to Cheryl in Newport, who's been sending private messages to Jerry. Anyway, it's the question that needs asking
Jacob.
More and more these days. Is Britain broken? Well, ministers seem to think so. As it has emerged, plans are being drawn up to help the justice system crack down on repeat offenders, specifically on crimes such as shoplifting, burglary and violence. The individuals in question will soon receive mandatory prison sentences, while repeat offences don't necessitate prison sentences. The new legislation seeks to resolve this through the Crime and Justice Bill. And this comes as figures reveal the police recorded nearly 400,000 cases of shoplifting, and yet only 48,000, about 14%, resulted in charges. Indeed, the British Retail Consortium predicts the actual number is closer to 8 million, costing roughly $1 billion to British businesses, but that gets passed on to us as consumers. Another component of ministers' plans is to extend the use of facial recognition technology. As it currently stands, only the Metropolitan South Wales Police use it. But ministers think this could streamline the justice process, especially as a wanted sex offender was found by a camera at the coronation earlier this year. He wasn't actually at the coronation. He was in the crowd, just to reassure you. Anyway, my panel's still with me, and the San Francisco reference was that in San Francisco you can shoplift up to $900 or something.
You don't shoplift, Jacob.
And then
You're a thief.
Oh, very good.
You're a thief.
OK.
You're not a shoplifter, and you're not a joyrider. You're a thief of a car.
OK, so you're in favour of these tougher sentences?
No, of course I'm not, because it's absolutely ridiculous. There's some spotty child of 25 at number 10 Downing Street who's saying, oh, Secretary of State, what a brilliant idea we've had. Look, you've got mandatory sentences for 3 burglars, 3 strikes...
But they don't actually happen, do they?
Yes, they do. Of course they do. What you've got to do is
we
get
had a policeman on last week who said they never seem to happen.
Well, we're talking absolute nonsense. Of course they happen.
He was
the
a
policeman. Well, the policeman should have... You should have asked the policeman. I'm sure you did. Well, why didn't you turn up? The biggest problem is, for burglaries, the police do not turn up.
But why don't the police turn up? Because since 2010, there's been a 33% reduction in the number of police. So there's not as many police to attend to.
It's gone back up again.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point.
It's gone back up, yes.
Back up.
However, they're not trained in the same way they were. So they're not a specialist. So you couldn't have somebody going to certain situations or doing fast pursuit driving, for example, because they're not trained in it yet. The police force isn't as well functioning.
No, but catching shoplifters, you don't
hang on a minute.
let's
go back to shoplifting. Let's go back to shoplifting. The reason it's not practical is because there's currently a court backlog of 60,000 cases. The police, as we've mentioned, are completely overstretched, and the prisons are stuffed. So they're already 10,000 over capacity. So you need to get rid of 10,000 before you can even put another one in.
We're on the same page on this, but you're nearly right. Crown Court, and we don't deal with shoplifters, but we will.
Thieves,
if
you called them a moment ago.
Yes, I know.
Do you know what you should actually call them? You should probably call them people in poverty or those addicted to drugs, because that's the overwhelming people who commit these petty shoplifting crimes. So I don't actually consider them criminals, even, really,
How do you mean
most
they're
cases.
not criminals?
Because most people are fueling an addiction.
So you'd like us to be San Francisco, which has completely gone to pot.
Yeah, I think probably I am a bit more San Francisco.
If someone burgles your house...
We're not talking about that, Jerry. We're talking about shoplifting.
OK, if someone steals from your local...
Tesco's.
Your local store, run by a family...
But why do we do this?
They are not criminals. Is that what you're saying?
Let's go stealing baby powder from Tesco's.
But they're
Does that person deserve to be in prison?
Well, I don't think they deserve to be in prison. They won't be sent to prison.
There's rarely an episode of shoplifting which would deserve a place in a prison.
You pick on baby powder, but baby powder, I read in the paper in the last few days, is being mixed in with drugs to bulk it up. So it depends why people are stealing baby powder. If they're stealing it because they're part of the drugs trade, of course you want them to go to prison.
I think that's quite an outrageous suggestion when there's
it was in the paper in this week about people using baby powder to bulk up drugs.
What's the biggest driver of shoplifting? It's poverty.
It's
drug
it's not, actually.
There's a functioning welfare system in this country that means nobody has to steal to get basic foodstuffs.
The functioning welfare system is shrinking, and unfortunately people have been drawn into poverty.
This isn't true.
For example...
Benefits are uprated in line with inflation in March.
Absolutely not. There's been caps. The two-child policy has put 250,000 additional children into poverty.
So you live... I know where you live, but I won't mention it on air.
How do you know where I live?
Because I spoke to your husband.
Oh.
Yeah. And he told me you live together. But, I mean, all right, you live in a nice part of the country, and I bet you've got a corner shop run by a lovely family whose margins are pretty difficult. Are you saying that someone who comes in and steals something from them is not a criminal?
What I'm saying is it shouldn't come to that. We should have prevention so that no one is driven to shoplifting. Well, if it was a repeat offender and there was violence involved, of course, fast-track that through the courts.
That's a different matter. That's a robbery.
But if it is a petty shoplifting...
That's a robbery.
That is such a waste of government money to end that in prison.
Even if they steal from Tesco's, prices for everybody else, including people who aren't well off, who shop in Tesco's, go up to compensate for it. There's no free theft.
But the thing is, the way the cost of living crisis has disproportionately affected people in poverty. So say if the price of pasta has gone up by 100%, which I think it has in some cases,
you can steal it then.
That will affect people on lower incomes a lot more than those on higher incomes.
So you can go and steal it then.
Unfortunately, the way the world is at the moment, more people are in poverty and more people are forced to shoplift.
Let's get on to face recognition. Is this a reasonable technique for the state to use, or is it going that bit too far?
It's a tricky one, particularly as most facial recognition is run by the Chinese.
I'm quite worried about it. I mean, I think there's too much CCTV coverage in the UK.
Oh, I don't think it's enough in many ways.
We need to be able to move about freely when we are innocent, and that the state can follow people too closely.
Yes, it's the Chinese thing that worries me.
Amy?
I hate to think that we've become a nation that has to be surveilled because there's so much petty crime going on, which, again, not to sound like a broken record, but I do feel that a lot of this is coming from this society in decline. We don't have enough connection anymore. We're losing respect for society in a way where now this type of thing that we're discussing is all the more common. And I think that's what makes me uncomfortable. I'd rather we focus on prevention over penalties, prevention over facial recognition technology.
Well, Amy, I think you've been coming on for a few weeks now. It's been a great pleasure. We found something we agree on. We're both a bit suspicious of facial recognition.
Chinese facial recognition.
And we're going to be talking a bit more about that in a moment. So thank you to my panel. Coming up, where's Britain's role in the world as we enter the multipolar order?
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my new show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m, where real people get to meet those in power and hold them to account. Every week, we'll be hearing your views from up and down the country in the real world. Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your mail Moggs. Now, Dan is a tough man. He says, I would support the death penalty being brought back for repeat offenders, and this is shoplifters. 10 convictions and you're done. That's 9 chances to go straight. We need to get tough. Even Singapore would find that a little tough. But anyway, thank you, Dan, for getting in touch. Last weekend, our AUKUS allies, Australia and America, agreed to step up military presence in the Indo-Pacific in a key move to counter the perceived threat from China. The US has promised to supply Australia with troops, aircraft and money to speed up Australia's missile manufacturing after concerns were raised about Peking's problematic behaviour and militarisation of the South China Sea. China's defence spending has significantly increased over the last 3 decades, with their spending now much, much higher than it was in competing, or getting close to competing, with America. The US Department of Defence claims that China's spending could be double the reported figures. Nevertheless, these plans build positively on the AUKUS agreement, which will see UK-designed submarines being used to protect and deter threats within the Indo-Pacific region. I'm very glad to be joined this evening by Tim Smith, the former Shadow Attorney General of Victoria. Tim, thank you for coming in. This seems to me to be a really important move, that it reassures Australia in terms of Australian security, but also it's the recognition that China is a real threat.
Well, Jacob, firstly, thank you very much for having me. But this is very, very serious. It's very serious for Britain. It's very serious for Australia, obviously. It's very serious for the United States, but it's very serious for global stability. I mean, China's got the largest navy in the world. It's got 400 nuclear warheads. It's got one of the largest intelligence programs in the world. And they are militarising the South China Sea. They are signing agreements with Western Pacific nations like the Solomon Islands. They are a threat to Australia. They are a threat to world peace. Now, the Chinese Navy has, will have this year probably 400 ships. The Royal Navy has 70. The Royal Australian Navy has 38. Australia, on a good day, probably has 200 long-range missiles it can use to defend itself. So Australia is seeing a geostrategic situation like it saw in the 1930s with the rise of Japan. And Australia is an island. So if it's cut off from our allies, particularly the United States, Australia can't defend itself.
And we know that China, the People's Republic of China, has some aggressive intentions. It's made it quite clear over Taiwan, over its behaviour around Taiwan, that it expects ultimately to take Taiwan back, to reunite China, and it's not afraid of using its military might at some point to do that.
CIA Director Burns said earlier this year that they have intelligence that the Chinese are preparing for war by 2027. Xi Jinping wants the PLA ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. Now,
and 2027 is an important date because it's the 100th
anniversary of the PLA.
Yeah.
Now, we all know that America engages in, strategic ambiguity with Taiwan, but in reality, it will come to Taiwan's aid. The question is, will Australia be compelled to accompany its ally, the United States, in the defence of Taiwan? I personally think it should. But Australia is not capable of doing that at the moment because our defence spending, like the United Kingdom's, is slightly less than 2% of GDP. The Americans spend 3% of their GDP on defence. Now, a bit like here, I don't think that we can simply rely on the United States to come to our defence every time we have a problem. Australia's going to have to spend more on defence. So is the United Kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need to work together as well, because China is a threat on a global scale. And if it were allowed to succeed in one area, that would be a problem for the rest of the world.
Of course. I mean, Xi Jinping is a threat to world peace. Xi Jinping is a Marxist-Leninist and a Chinese nationalist that wishes to essentially undo what he believes is the 100 years of shame of the 19th century.
And what's interesting about this is the development, because until Xi Jinping took over, China did seem to be entering the modern world order, that it seemed to be cooperating with it seemed to want to become part of it, and it was growing rich on the back of it.
Yes.
Xi has rather changed that, but the West was quite slow to wake up. You had the UK government talking about a golden age in relations.
Yes.
But then you've had AUKUS, you've had the deal with India, Japan, the US and Australia. You've now got this arrangement, and you've had about $350 million of support going to Taiwan announced very recently. This is all intelligence-led, isn't it? It's not just theorising.
This is not politicians deciding that we're going to give Australia nuclear-powered submarines. This is coming from the Five Eyes defence and intelligence sharing arrangement between Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States and Britain. This is coming from high, very, very significant intelligence gathering by our allies about China's intentions. China's intentions are very dangerous, And the fact that our intelligence people have said that Australia needs nuclear submarines, that Britain has pivoted back into the Indo-Pacific for the first time in decades, well, that is no coincidence. That Britain's back in the Indo-Pacific, that is to counter China, because British intelligence knows that China is a threat to Britain's national interests and indeed global stability.
And we should take these intelligence warnings very seriously, because before Russia invaded Ukraine,
yes,
the intelligence services were telling everybody this was about to happen. There was an unprecedented openness by the US and the UK intelligence services to say what was about to happen. And lots of commentators ignored it and said, oh, no, I'm sure that's not right.
Of course it's not going to happen.
But they're now saying similar things about China, and it's really important that we wake up to this.
Well, it's incredibly important, and I can understand why viewers tonight will be saying, well, China's a very long way away from the United Kingdom. Well, it is and it isn't. It's very close to some very key allies of the United Kingdom, particularly allies that have stood with the United Kingdom post-Brexit, like Australia. Britain's most important ally, the United States. The United States is a Pacific power as much...
Australia's our most important ally.
Thank you, Jacob.
Even though you've retained the Ashes.
Well, we'll get on to the cricket in a minute, but Taiwan, and Liz Truss has made this point a number of times, Taiwan is the next great, I suppose, collision point between democracy and authoritarianism. And if Taiwan was to fall, that would be a disaster for the world.
As we've seen historically, if we don't stand with our allies, then the bad guys get to win. Anyway, thank you very much, Tim. That's all from me. And I'm not here tomorrow, so it's me until Thursday. Up next, it's the great Professor Daniel Wootton. Dan, what's coming up on your programme?
We miss you tomorrow, Jacob, but great show tonight. We have got lots on the way, actually. Megyn Kelly has sat down with Ron DeSantis. Is his political ambition of becoming the US president now over? She'll reveal all from that interview. Plus Tom Bower with the latest on the Royals, and Richard Tice, the leader of Reform UK, on the Nigel Farage debanking scandal.
That's an absolutely terrific lineup. Everyone want to be glued to that. I'm going to be back tomorrow. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation. Next week, I'm going to be broadcasting the programme from Somerset, so you'll be able to see exactly how beautiful the weather is there and how it's always sunny, except today I think there might have been a little bit of rain, but now it's the weather.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hi there, it's Aidan McGivern here with the GB News forecast. Turning wet again overnight. Heavy showers replace the rain into Wednesday, but unseasonable winds, especially along southern coastal parts of England. An area of low pressure is developing over the Atlantic. That's going to move through central parts overnight. It's going to bring the strongest winds on the southern flank and some heavy rain ahead of it into Northern Ireland later this evening, passing through Wales, southern and central England, and then eventually northern and eastern England seeing the wet weather by dawn, as well as southern Scotland. Now, northern Scotland stays clear overnight, and here temperatures will dip into the single figures, but elsewhere those temperatures will stay at 13, 14, 15 Celsius. But it is a wet and windy start to Wednesday. The wettest weather will be across Northern Ireland, central and southern Scotland, northern England. Another band of rain moves through southern counties for a while, carried through on a strengthening wind with the risk of gales for coastal areas, 50, perhaps 60 mile-per-hour wind gusts. That could cause impacts if you're taking part in outdoor activities, for example, or camping. And another thing that could be impactful, very heavy showers and thunderstorms through central parts. That all clears through, and by Thursday, it's a much brighter start to the day. Some sunshine out there. Quite quickly, though, the cloud fills in and further showers develop by the afternoon. Hit and miss downpours, and the wind from the north will make it feel on the cold side. Similar conditions on Friday before another low arrives on Saturday.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.